The final prayer. Father Daniel had heard every kind of confession, sins whispered through trembling lips, secrets soaked in shame, but nothing had ever terrified him. Until now. The man entered the church just before midnight, tall, gaunt, his skin stretched to tight over his bones. He walked with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had nowhere left to go. He knelt in the confessional, the wooden partition barely hiding his face. His breath reeked of iron. Man, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. Daniel's spine stiffened. There was something wrong with his voice. Father Daniel, how long since your last confession? A pause, then, man, I don't remember, but I remember them. A wet sound, like flesh peeling from bone. Daniel swallowed. What have you done? The man chuckled, low and broken. Man, I made them beautiful. The first one, I painted with blood. The second, I hollowed out, so the light could pass through. The third, his breath hitched. For the first time, he sounded almost afraid. Man, she wouldn't stop praying. A sharp metallic clang, something dropped to the confessional floor. A rosary. Father Daniel stared. The silver beads were stained red. His pulse hammered. He knew this rosary. It belonged to Sister Maria. She had gone missing 3 nights ago. Daniel's hands shook. Why are you telling me this? The man leaned closer. His lips brushed the wooden grate. Man, because I need to know if God is still watching me. Silence. Then, the smell hit Daniel, rotten copper, and something deeper. He glanced down. A dark puddle seeped under the confessional door. Blood. Still warm. He stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. The man laughed, a sound like cracking ribs. Man, you don't believe, do you? The light inside the church flickered. Shadows stretched. The wooden confessional groaned, as if something inside it was growing. Man, you should. Daniel turned to flee, but the door was already open, and the confessional was empty, except for the rosary, still dripping. The collector. In the quiet town of Black Hollow, the murders began without warning. Victims disappeared 4 days, only to reappear in their own homes, seated at dinner tables or tucked into beds, posed as if still alive. But their bodies told another story, skin carved with precision, their faces frozen in terror. Detective Laura Grayson had seen horrors in her 20 years on the force, but this was different. There was something methodical, almost reverent, about the way the killer worked. No fingerprints, no DNA, just a single calling card left at each scene. A small figurine carved from bone, its features grotesque and mocking. The media dubbed the killer the Collector. After months of dead ends, a break finally came. A hiker stumbled upon an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Inside, Laura and her team found shelves lined with jars of teeth, locks of hair, and the unmistakable carvings of bone figurines. It was a gallery of the dead, but what chilled Laura most wasn't the trophies. It was the diary they found on the table. The entries weren't the ramblings of a madman. They were eloquent, thoughtful. Each described the killer's rationale for choosing their victims. The teacher who tormented students, the businessman who bankrupted families, the nurse who neglected her patients. Every life taken was, in the killer's mind, a correction, a brutal form of justice. One entry, dated a week earlier, read, "The detective will come. She follows her own rules, hides her own sins. But she understands why I do this. She see the truth." Laura's hands trembled as she read it. The words cut deep, not because they were wrong, but because they were uncomfortably close to the truth. She'd bent the law before, covered up her own mistakes that had cost lives. That night, Laura sat alone in her apartment, the diary on her lap. She felt the weight of her own guilt pressing down. She tried to sleep, but dreams of hollow eyes and bone figurines haunted her. When she awoke, a small object sat on her bedside table, a figurine, carved in her likeness, its expression one of quiet judgment. The message was clear. The collector wasn't finished, and Laura wondered if, in the end, she might agree with their verdict. The Bone Collector. The children of Raven's Hollow had a rhyme. If you see the blackbird fly, close your eyes or say goodbye. Step too close, you'll hear the call. Then he'll take your bones and all. For decades, people disappeared near the old Blackwood Cemetery. Some were last seen walking its foggy paths at dusk. Others simply vanished from their homes, doors still locked from the inside. Their bodies were never found. Detective Laura Grayson didn't believe in ghost stories. When another resident, Matthew Kane, a local teacher, vanished without a trace, she was determined to uncover the truth. Her investigation led her to the Blackwood family crypt, a towering mausoleum at the cemetery's heart. The Blackwoods had been gravediggers for generations, their bloodline stretching back to the town's founding. The last of them, Edgar Blackwood, had died over a century ago, yet fresh footprints led to the crypt's entrance. Inside, the air was thick with decay. Dust-coated coffins lined the walls, but the real horror lay below. A hidden staircase led Laura into a cavernous chamber where hundreds of bones were stacked in unnatural, patterned spirals, towers, grotesque sculptures. In the center stood a wooden chair. Strapped to it was Matthew Kane. He was alive, but barely. His skin sunken, his eyes wild with terror. His fingers had been meticulously removed, the wounds blackened as if burned. Then came the whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Laura spun around, gun raised. A figure emerged from the shadows, impossibly tall, its face obscured by a black veil. It moved without sound, its skeletal fingers curling in the air. "You take from the earth," it rasped. "I take from you." Before Laura could react, the figure moved. Darkness swallowed her, her limbs frozen as something cold traced her spine. The next morning, two things were found at the cemetery: Matthew Kane, missing his hands but alive, and a new sculpture in the bone chamber crafted from Laura Grayson's skeleton, posed as if she was still reaching for her gun. The Silent Ones. The first murder went unnoticed. A drifter, found in the alley behind Miller's Tavern, throat slit clean. No family, no history, no one to miss him. The second was harder to ignore. Rebecca Holloway, a beloved schoolteacher, discovered in her kitchen, eyes wide, mouth sewn shut with black thread. By the third, the town of Briar's Rest was drowning in fear. The killer left no fingerprints, no footprints, only a message, carved into each victim's skin. "You let it happen." Sheriff Tom Grayson was running out of answers. The townspeople whispered in tight circles, fear twisting their faces. Someone knew something, but no one dared speak. Then Tom received a letter. No return address, just a single line. "You ignored the screams. Now they will be yours." That night, Tom searched the town records, piecing together a buried truth. Years ago, a girl named Lillian Crow had gone missing. No investigation, no search, just silence. She had been taken by powerful men, and the town had looked away. Tom barely heard the floor creak behind him before the blade sank deep into his back. He gasped, pain exploding through his body, as strong hands turned him over. A figure loomed above him, face hidden behind a mask of sewn flesh. The killer spoke in a whisper, not a voice, but many, layered on top of each other. A chorus of the forgotten. "You let it happen." As darkness swallowed him, Tom finally understood. The Silent Ones were not ghosts. They were vengeance, and they were not done. The scars we leave. The town of Coldwater never talked about the Hollow Man. Not in whispers, not in warnings. It was as if pretending he didn't exist would make it true. But every year, on the same night, someone disappeared, and a week later, they returned stitched together, reshaped, wrong. Detective Mara Holt had seen the victims. Their bodies were puzzles of human flesh, parts taken from others, mouths sewn shut as if to silence their final screams. It wasn't just murder, it was something worse. This year, Mara was going to stop it. She stayed awake the night of the Hollow Man's return, patrolling the streets, gun in hand. Hours passed, nothing happened. Then, at 3:06 a.m., her radio crackled. A voice whispered, "You've been chosen." Pain erupted in her side. She turned, no one was there. Blood seeped through her shirt, but the wound wasn't fresh. It was stitched, as if it had already been made and closed again. Then the world around her changed. The building stretched taller, darker, like bones jutting from the earth. The streetlights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows, and from those shadows he emerged. The hollow man had no face, just a mass of scars where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. His fingers, long and stitched from different hands, reached for her. Mara fired. The bullet sank into him, but did nothing. "You don't understand," the hollow man whispered, though he had no mouth. "I don't kill, I take. The town makes me. Their silence feeds me. Every crime buried, every sin ignored, it gives me shape, gives me purpose." Mara fell to her knees, the stitches on her body tightening, pulling. She could feel herself unraveling, becoming something new. The next morning, a new victim was found. It was Mara, or at least part of her, and somewhere, in the shifting dark, the hollow man grew stronger. The Bone Collector. The children of Raven's Hollow had a rhyme. If you see the blackbird fly, close your eyes or say goodbye. Step too close, you'll hear the call. Then he'll take your bones and all. For decades, people disappeared near the old Blackwood Cemetery. Some were last seen walking its foggy paths at dusk. Others simply vanished from their homes, doors still locked from the inside. Their bodies were never found. Detective Laura Grayson didn't believe in ghost stories. When another resident, Matthew Kane, a local teacher, vanished without a trace, she was determined to uncover the truth. Her investigation led her to the Blackwood family crypt, a towering mausoleum at the cemetery's heart. The Blackwoods had been gravediggers for generations, their bloodline stretching back to the town's founding. The last of them, Edgar Blackwood, had died over a century ago, yet fresh footprints led to the crypt's entrance. Inside, the air was thick with decay. Dust-coated coffins lined the walls, but the real horror lay below. A hidden staircase led Laura into a cavernous chamber where hundreds of bones were stacked in unnatural, patterned spirals, towers, grotesque sculptures. In the center stood a wooden chair. Strapped to it was Matthew Kane. He was alive, but barely. His skin sunken, his eyes wild with terror. His fingers had been meticulously removed, the wounds blackened as if burned. Then came the whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Laura spun around, gun raised. A figure emerged from the shadows, impossibly tall, its face obscured by a black veil. It moved without sound, its skeletal fingers curling in the air. "You take from the earth," it rasped. "I take from you." Before Laura could react, the figure moved. Darkness swallowed her, her limbs frozen as something cold traced her spine. The next morning, two things were found at the cemetery: Matthew Kane, missing his hands but alive, and a new sculpture in the bone chamber crafted from Laura Grayson's skeleton, posed as if she were still reaching for her gun. The man in the fog. The town of Ashford was cursed. Every few years, on the coldest night of winter, the fog would roll in thick, suffocating, unnatural, and with it came him. No one knew his name. No one had ever seen his face. But by dawn, a house would be open, a family inside slaughtered, not just killed, arranged, eyes gouged, mouths stretched into eerie grins, fingers carefully intertwined, as if holding hands in some grotesque prayer. The town learned to hide when the fog came. Doors were locked, curtains drawn, candles snuffed out. If you saw him, he saw you, and then you were next. Ben Holloway never believed the stories. He called it mass hysteria, a ghost story passed down to keep children inside. So, when the fog crept in one December night, he did what no one else dared. He walked into it. The silence was deafening. The world outside, the mist disappeared, swallowed in grey. Then footsteps, slow, measured, coming closer. Ben's breath hitched. He turned. A figure stood there, tall, wrapped in tattered black. Its head tilted unnaturally. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin where a face should be. The man in the fog. Ben tried to run, but the mist pressed in, thick as hands around his throat. The figure did not move yet. It was suddenly closer. A whisper slithered through the air. "You looked." Pain exploded in Ben's chest. He gasped, looking down. His ribs, they were shifting, twisting, breaking outward. The last thing he saw was his own reflection in the fog, his face stretching into a grin. The next morning, the mist was gone, and in the town square stood a new statue, carved from bone, its mouth curled into an eternal smile. No one questioned where it came from. No one ever did.
I'll see you soon. Missed me? What made you show up? You know me. I am not leaving my best friends behind. You couldn't forgive you betrayal. You don't stand a chance against our fleet. Really, that's crazy. Once for each. I don't remember asking. That's all I give you. What's left of your former glory?